There have been a lot of album releases since I've started these reviews. I've been able to cover most of my favorites and the most notable, but there are of course a good few I've missed. Albums that I've heard and just didn't have enough to say about them for a full review. So I decided to start this series, the Mini Review Mix, where I cover some albums that I want to talk about, but I don't exactly fully plan on reviewing, or just first impressions of albums. These will drop sporadically. Sometimes I'll have multiple mini review mixes in a month, other times there won't be one in many months. Also, the albums discussed here are in no particular order. Without further ado, let's get into it. Teaches Dust to Reason is the first studio-recorded solo piece by Alex Kent under his own full name. Kent was the frontman of Sprain, now reformed as Sheerlin, one of my favorite bands currently working today. I've been waiting relatively impatiently for anything to officially release from his solo project Big Brown Cow or Sheerlin. Both projects have had live performances on YouTube that just knock my socks off. This is a new release essentially made for fun, meant to, I guess, tide me and other Alex Kent fans over until a release from either project. This album is made up of two massive drone and noise and experimental pieces that just kind of exist and move around all over the place structurally. The second track has more of a structure as it mostly contains a rising organ note moving forwards and forwards constantly. The album is definitely the living embodiment of experimental, oftentimes rejecting musicality entirely in exchange for oddity. But even without the impressive lyricism, the intense emotion, and the riveting heart of Kent's more serious works, he's still able to put out a relatively impressive cataclysm of sounds. Endlessness is my first exposure to jazz artist Nala Sinephro. This is a combination of space ambient and jazz fusion, and this feels like a modern classic for both genres. I feel like this kind of very traditional Moog-exploitation style of space ambient isn't very common nowadays because many of the classic albums just came from that technology being new and exciting. Endlessness brings the clarity and clearness that modern music tech brings and incorporates the slow and methodically spiritual post-promises jazz fusion sound. I did honestly start to grow tired of the sound towards the half-hour mark as I felt Sinephro had gone through every idea that she had already. I think re-listening to this one will be quite difficult because of that boredom towards the second half. However, I think that an expansion upon this sound with some additional concepts could make for a stunning future release. For now, we have a pretty damn solid modern piece of space ambience. Sky 100 is the latest by cult-beloved Korean shoegaze artist Parannoul. I've enjoyed previous Parannoul works, however I haven't exactly connected with them in the same way that others do. I swear, people are obsessed with Parannoul as though he's some sort of shoegaze godsend, which only makes what I'm about to say harder. I don't really care for this album much. I'm sure the songwriting and the performances are excellent. I only wish I could hear them clearly. This album is produced and mixed horribly. I'm no expert and I'm sure I couldn't do much better myself, but this actually just hurts to listen to. The vocals and the drums and occasionally the pianos are just mixed so loudly, they just totally overshadow everything else. Why is this album mixed so loudly? Seriously, this is one of the loudest albums I've heard this year, for no real reason. It just feels so overblown. On my first attempt to listen to it around the week of its release, it genuinely gave me a throbbing headache, and that's really what prevented me from reviewing it in full around when it released. Instead, I opted to finally finish my listen later and not have to think about it much. The second half of Lights Off Repentance is cool, I guess, just wow, this is a step down from what I've heard previously of Parannoul. What were they thinking when they produced and mixed and mastered this? Midwife is a Flenser-signed slowcore artist. This is her first full-length solo LP since 2021's Luminol. However, it's my only experience with her music, and having heard it, it was a pretty good experience. I know with the genre name, this should be obvious, but this album is slow. Slower than most slowcore. It takes its sweet time with everything, and I really respect that. The pace is what makes tracks like the opener, Rock and Roll Never Forgets, so great. What a haunting song. It views rock and roll as a concept like this godlike entity, a spin of how it was treated in the classic rock and roll days of the 50s and 60s, but made far darker. What a creatively written track. From there, some tracks like Vanessa are more full with percussion and a hook, but for the most part, it's just guitar drenched in reverb. Tracks like Autoluminescent, Drovane, and Killdozer remind me of Grouper's psychedelic folk side. That is the biggest compliment I could give this album. Surely the best in slowcore this year. Exhaust is the latest and most acclaimed from Brooklyn-based death metal group Pyrrhon. Just like many other albums I'm discussing today, this is my first experience with the group. 2024 has been an incredible year for metal, and this is maybe the single weirdest of all the metal albums I've heard this year. The guitar lines are so obtuse and dissonant and overall bizarre. Songs twist and turn constantly to keep the listener on their toes. And the drums somehow follow along so excellently for a blistering backdrop. The vocals are a constantly shifting array of screams, from the low doom metal burping screams to the high-pitched screamo screams and everything in between. Each song has the structure of me waving my arms around trying to explain why Succession is the best show of all time. It's like each song has 10 smaller songs inside of it. Following them is like getting lost in a maze of heaviness and weirdness. I love it so much. And the lyrics are so simple yet so dense, critiquing a world with further hatred, isolation, and most of all, an overproduction and excess, inevitably leading to our crisp, burning downfall as a species. There's an obvious feeling of disappointment and anger in the lyricism all throughout that cuts so deep, as though a heavy, anarchistic punk who has fought for many decades has finally caved and crumbled into a fetal position. What an intense and strange album, one of my favorites of the year, most certainly my metal album of the year right now, which I can only see growing on me with more and more listens. So those were my takes on some albums that have been released in the past 2 months or so. Let me know what you think of these albums. See you all next week for my apology video for speaking ill of the almighty True Blue interlude. You can stop commenting now. Until next time, that is all.